I am Justin Thomas James from Sound Booth Theater. Of course, I'm here with Lars M., the author of the World of Chains Lit RPG series. And Lars, you and Sound Booth Theater have been working together since the very first Lit RPG you wrote, was it?
Yeah,
The Wayward Bard?
very first book I ever wrote, and you actually found the grace to give me a chance, and that
I
means
had the
half a lot for me.
pleasure. I had the pleasure of narrating The Wayward Bard. Would you go into a little bit more detail, Lars, about what we're dealing with Lit RPG for those who don't know?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a spectrum, but as you say, lit RPG would typically, for those really nerding the genres, would
Mm,
typically be the heavier end of the scale, where you really have a lot of game elements inside the fiction. You have character sheets, you have stats and attributes, often quests and the like. A lot of game elements that contribute to the story itself and form a heavy part of the story itself. Then
And
there's
where would you say the Wayward Bard and World of Chains fits within that spectrum of Lit RPG?
we have quite a bit of crunch, as the cool kids call it. I mean, there are
Yes.
quite a lot of game details. We have quests, items, feats, and, well, a lot of level ups and skills that you just contribute to make the main characters more defined, and tell us exactly what is going on here, and then exactly which issues, how, and which tools can they use to make their way forward. I mean, who hasn't always wanted to know exactly which kind of damage Aragon's sword? But yeah, that detail of adding details and making the system and the game itself part of the story and come just as much to the forefront of the story as the story itself.
Right. And it's a tricky thing to do with the genre is, making it crunchy, but still making it, like you're not reading just an old calculator that's in a book. It's trying to get it so that those numbers actually add to the story can be complicated, I imagine.
Definitely, and also ensuring that you're not completely bogged down in status updates and quest updates all the time. I mean, if you keep on improving your skills and levels and whatnot, then you can easily end up with a story that has about 80% just status updates, and nobody wants to read that. Or, I mean, somebody do, but not everybody wants to read that. Let me
Not
correct that.
everybody. The Wayward Bard, Fallen Bard, Emissary Bard is all set in a virtual reality, massively multiplayer online game. And it is called The World of Chains, this specific game itself. And let's talk a little bit about the lore. We've got the crunch, but what is it about the World of Chains, first of all, that sets it apart from other MMOs that you have played?
Well, at least I'd say it has one part of MMOs that I really dig when they manage to create that. There are a lot of MMOs that are very on the surface. I mean, there's nothing. Everything that goes on is part of the main story. You get a lot of details of what's going on, which battles are you undergoing right now, but that there's pretty much only the top layer going on.
Mm.
But what is really interesting to me is when you then below that have other details going on that are just as compelling and interesting as these higher, usually more action demanding sequences. Like,
Mm.
take the Witcher, for instance. Huge world, and it has a lot of action, a lot of conflicts going on between armies and such. But when you move below that, I mean, when you when you move a bit further down, and you taking some of the lore from the quests and the books and whatever you find around, lying around the game, you find that there are actually a lot of other details going on. There are is a lot of what do you call it? Stress
beyond behind the scenes.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of racism inside the game itself. There's a lot of there are a lot of struggles between non-magic users, magic users, and a lot of differences in the society. And that part where you have an undergoing and other stories going on behind the curtain or behind the scene, which you can explore if you so decide. That's what I really wanted. And that's what I love about the World of Change. I mean, yeah, it's a game where you can, like everybody else, you can log in, you can enjoy yourself for a week, taking part in a tournament, wanting to become a better archer, and so on. Or you can also dig into the secrets. Mm-hmm. You can move quite a bit below. You can figure out, well, what is it exactly in the lore of this world? What is going on? I mean, there's a rich story, a rich background that you can explore. Right. And that, especially, that digging for lore tidbits that you also have from, let's say, the Dark Souls. I don't know if you've ever
I have played Dark Souls, very frustrating game, I do admit.
Extremely. Yeah. I've rage quit that game so many times. But there is also, if you find some of the giga nerds, I'm not that into it, but there is a world of lore to that game that is just breathtaking if you choose to dig into it.
That's interesting. It's a subtle. It's there. It's a subtle thing. And Dark Souls is a great example because it is. If you want it to be, it can just be on the surface, a hack and slash, a really hard game where you beat bosses. Yeah. And that's one that I've mostly played it like that. But if you do go deeper, that lore is there for you. The depth, but it's done in a very subtle way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There are references. There are a lot of points. There are a lot of names and phrases that go again that you just, if you don't pay attention to it, if you just play it as a button masher, or it's never a button masher, but because then you die. But if you play it like just take your brain off and play to survive in the Dark Souls, you'll miss it. But it's really rich and it's crazy detail. I mean, I've had a geek friend of mine just rave to me about it for hours, and I was like, no, that can't be. I mean, it's just
Dark Souls.
Exactly.
So for World of Change, then this world itself, the lore. Obviously, you spend a lot of time thinking about the lore and the undercurrents of society and what races get along with what other races from which cities and all of that. Can you walk us through a little bit of what that process looks like for you when you're thinking of the lore?
Yeah, I mean, first off, it's mostly about history to begin with. I mean, that sounds boring as fuck, I know, but in order to come to this point in history where we have this tiny village set in the middle of nothing, which really shouldn't have anything interesting to give. Well, in order to make that interesting, you have to have a lot of history behind that. You have to have a lot of history as to why do some species hate others? Why is this place important? And which conflicts have raged back and forth across the continent to create interesting places such as the Cobalt villages inside the forest itself. That history I've had a really grumpy chronicler invented for this instance and had him retell the story of the World of Change. What has happened how did the originally very pretty and rich and conflict-ridden continent of the world of change, how did it tear itself apart, and how has it started rebuilding itself? What is the current image? How has this created strains on the society? Why are a lot of orcs currently addicted to one substance or another? Why do people actively hate ratlings a lot of the time, and especially summoners? I mean, those details I've invented the reasoning for, and they're not always good reasons, of course, and most of them, some of them can be lies, but they are lies that are accepted by the popular voice inside this world. So basically, creating the history behind the entire world has set the scene for most of what I then want to invent.
You mentioned Dark Souls. You mentioned The Witcher.
Yeah.
These are video games that have influenced you, I imagine. What would you say were the video games that you really felt like you were pulling from when thinking about writing The Wayward Bard?
EverQuest 2 also.
EverQuest 2,
yeah,
okay.
I mean, that has been my main or largest addiction, you might say. No, that was seriously an addiction. I mean, that was about 12 plus hours a day for more than a year. So yeah,
okay.
I've spent my time in that, and what I loved about about EverQuest 2 was also it was not as cutesy as World of Warcraft. It had that gritty, bloody feeling to it, and it also had a very detailed crafting system which I love. So yeah, EverQuest 2 was one of the main.
When did the click happen for you that you wanted to take your video game experience, your author or your reading experience, and start putting it towards your own project?
At the point where I felt that, this sounds so horrible, but I felt like the world needed my story. That's horrible.
Oh, of course.
What I mean is, at that point, nobody had actually created a Bard story that wasn't just revolving around music and tits.
Okay, gotcha.
I mean,
so those already existed. There are Bard stories, but this is what you get when you sign up for a Bard story.
I mean, it's natural. We also know everybody who's ever played a pen and paper game who's had a Bard knows that the Bard rules the tavern room.
They have a reputation.
And they always take the tavern wench back home. But there is more to it. And that story wasn't there. So that was what I really saw. Well, this is a genre that if you know about computer games, you are able to at least create a convincing computer game. I did not know at that time if my writing was going to entirely suck, but I was willing to give it a chance because I felt like the computer part of it and the Bard part of it, I knew enough to maybe get by there, and I want to see if my writing might be intolerable. So that's where it started. That part where I thought, why isn't there a story about this?
Who were the authors in that period that there's the authors that you were influenced by that you didn't want to write like them, but who were the authors that you saw what they were doing in the genre and you thought, hey, like, I like this, I want to go with something like this?
Number one at that time, without discussion, Apollos Thorne. There are a lot of examples also of people who write exceedingly well in the genre and do it on a very light and very emotionally limited not limited, but they do not
more
go
of a
that
simpler
far.
level.
Yeah, exactly. They don't go that far into how exactly a 100% realistic game would influence you. Apollo's Thorn does that. His codename Freedom to me was one of the wow experiences where he both had a really amazing game system that has one of the better ways of explaining how could a realistic VR MMO actually work. And he also had the games have an effect on the player's psyche, because obviously you won't be able to kill people or things for 12 hours on end, or actually get beaten or tortured to death at a realistic pain level without having something happen to you. And that part of taking just enough realism into it, and then, of course, having everything else be a fantasy, because you also need something fantastic to make it interesting. I love that.
Do you have specific questions that you want to answer with the Wayward Bard? And you don't have to give us any spoilers or with World of Chains, but that you're kind of asking yourself and maybe asking the reader in World of Chains.
It's there is the question of how much of this game, how much of gaming is escape. I mean, we all, for, I don't know, 20, 30 years, we've seen this question coming up all the time. Is gaming actually good for something? There has been a lot of talk of, well, why are you wasting your time inside the games? I mean, but as more and more people get into games, find their spouse in games, like Katie Hanna, you know her, the Somni Online.
Yep.
She found her husband inside EverQuest.
Wow.
And the more you actually find meaningful connections and learn stuff through games, well, the more I find it an interesting question whether we should actually look more into games as to, well, can we actually learn something from them? And this is one of the things I also want to put out there, like having my MC, my main character, who is very much not an exceedingly clever or world-wise person, go in and see, well, can this be good for him? In more than of course it can be good for him if he actually gets away with all the money he stole, but it can also be good for him and educational as a person. So,
right. Obviously, there's a lot of music in the Wayward Bard, the entire series. And what music would you love to bring into Arcangelo's repertoire?
Okay. I mean, there is always the obvious. I mean, I have been dying to get some of the Firefly themes into the book for quite a while now, but that's in the past. We will forget all about that. But I would love to see some Sabaton.
Sabaton?
Yes. It's power metal, mostly.
Okay, yeah.
But they have these really huge ensembles, thunderous and progressive, really powerful ensembles that I think would be just amazing done as a classical approach. I mean, it would be, they are powerful, and they could do really well translated to the violin.
Well, there you have it. Lars M., everybody, the author of World of Chains, Wayward Bard, Fallen Bard, Emissary Bard, a new series in the works.
Yeah.
And you can check out the Wayward Bard already. It's already available on Amazon as an ebook and on Audible as an audiobook, produced by Sound Booth Theater, and it has violin music in it. See, my camera is nodding in agreement that you should check it out. Yes, violin by Michelle Odorico. So I highly recommend you check out The Wayward Bard and The Fallen Bard. And Emissary Bard is on its way soon.
Wonderful being with you as usual, man.